Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate. I believe he's a cognitive psychologist who specialises in language development in children. So the book essentially concerns two contrasting theories of human nature. One is the traditionally, historically held up biological one, which was very much based on, right, if you're black, you're dependent on being a certain way. If your father was a certain way, then you're going to be a certain way. If your mother was a certain way, that will again be in the mix. And how that changed to the complete contrasting opposite, which was called the blank slate. And the blank slate was something that said that we're all entirely malleable, and that our views, our size, our shape is completely contingent upon our social and cultural upbringing. Part of the blank slate entails the noble savage, which is the idea that left to ourselves, we would be completely peaceful and normal human beings and wouldn't rely too much on violence at all, as well as the ghost in the machine, which advocates a kind of free will in a way, because the idea between the ghost in the machine is essentially that no matter what kind of stimulus is given to you, there's always something in the back of your mind, that kind of self who pulls the levers and says, oh no, I'm actually going to react to this in this way. So those are the two other doctrines that come along with the blank slate theory of human nature. Now, initially it was cognitive psychology in the early days, which took a step away from this by saying that, right, we can understand and study parts of the brain to do with memory, recall, language, inhibitions, or changing our inhibitions, and how that relates to different parts of the brain, and we can study them through neuroscience or any different kinds of a number of battery tests, which stepped away from saying that, at least in the physical sense, our brain is not entirely like this kind of silly putty that Steven Pinker mentions in the book. So we're not entirely malleable in the very least of the physical sense. So there are three primary motivating factors in the blank slate, and one of them initially is this kind of fear of eugenics or discrimination. So obviously, historically, very bastardized versions of evolutionary psychology or behavioral genetics, all of this kind of stuff has been put into something along the lines of like Nazism, or very hard right philosophies that everything is contingent upon what kind of race you belong to, what kind of subset of people you belong to, and this is the only factor that we really have. So one of those fears there is that if we say, for example, that, not that this is true, but if it was an example, that white people had higher levels of IQ, for example, that if you didn't rely on a blank slate theory of human nature, then you would be pushed towards saying, right, well, there is a definite biological explanation for this, and we can separate and definitively say, and therefore discriminate against people who are not white on the basis of IQ. So certain jobs in society that might need higher IQ, they would typically be given to white people in that instance. Another one of the fears is imperfectibility. So this idea that it's this kind of fatalist or nihilist point of view that's very much right, well, if this is our human nature, then what's really the point in changing it, because we can't really substantially deviate from some of the violence or gender differences or any of the impacts it may have on children. So what's the point, because in the long run we're just fighting against, we're fighting against an uphill battle here. One of the opposite issues with this that's motivated by the blank slate is that if we are completely malleable, then the idea of mass social engineering is very tempting in the eyes of a lot of very hard left-leaning people who are saying that we're entirely, or a majority of the time, very malleable, because if we step away from biological stuff and say that we're entirely malleable, that means that we can be made into these completely egalitarian, very idealistic human beings. So that's where a lot of the kind of left-leaning atrocities have happened that are motivated by a blank slate theory of human nature, such as the Khmer Rouge, different communities or ideas that have happened in Vietnam, especially in Russia, because if you have this idea of imperfectibility, then whereby mass social engineering leads to a kind of murderous death cult. So yeah, there's a lot of hard left people who might advocate a very blank slate theory of human nature, but don't realise that if you do, the possibility that you can come to this kind of mass social engineering and lack of any kind of political or social freedom, it's very easy to get to that kind of position. So another fear is the fear of determinism. So that it's similar to this kind of perfectibility. Like we're fighting an uphill battle. So what's really the point in actually trying to change anything about ourselves? And just because we're in some sense relating to the last fear, imperfectible, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to make situations or societies or economies better for ourselves along these lines. Because if we can figure out how that we can along these lines change our societies in the most intuitive way, that should be what we're aiming for, not in just saying that, well, we tend to be prone to violence, but that doesn't mean that we're accepting the violence. It's the same thing as saying, say, if you were to accept that men might be across many different cultures or many different species very prone to rape, it doesn't mean that we're accepting rape anymore. We're actually clamping down on it more because we understand its background a lot more. We're not accepting it in any single way. So some of the primary defences of the blank slate theory of human nature, one of which is connectionism, which is this idea that because our brain fundamentally relies upon different parts of the brain to recall language or experience, and that these are all interconnected experiences that we've learned, that the social side of this is the only bit that we can rely on. We've socially learned everything and everything is connected in that sense. But it also ignores that you need a primary springboard to be able to connect all of these things together. I mean, we don't just connect language together through experience. It's connected by this underlying biological function we have for language. I mean, no one just parrots the same language that they hear everyone else say. We combine it and we change it and we come up with things of our own, and language is ever changing. It's not a fixed, parroted, socially constructed thing. It's ubiquitous across all of humans and a lot of mammals in their different communicative styles. The strange ones that comes up here is the number of genes. So with the number of, I think it was the Human Genome Project, once they sequenced some part of our genes, that said there was something like 30 to 40,000, but possibly even as much as 100,000 genes. But I think the conservative estimate was 30 to 40,000 genes that were responsible for our makeup and who we are. So the idea is that if we have less and less genes that combine to make us who we are, we can't have that many genes that predispose us to a number of different situations. So for example, if you had 1 million genes, there's 1 million different genes that can code for exactly how we react to different stimulus, how we react to aggression, how we react to different things happening in the environment. But say if we only had 10 genes, then that reduces the kind of what some people think of as biological determinism, that we could be determined by just those 10 genes, which is an absolutely arbitrary number and ridiculous response in my opinion, because how could you possibly put a number on this as having more or less free will? So if we have 40,000 genes, we have a decent amount of free will, but if we have 100,000, then we have a very small ability to have any kind of free will. I just think it's complete arbitrary nonsense, to be honest. The other defense usually comes from neuroplasticity, so this idea that in a lot of different neuroscience studies, which is very cherry picking of people who want to defend the blank slate in this way, but that through losing certain capacities, like capacities for language, if a certain part of the brain is affected or dies off, then there is another part, typically in the other hemisphere of the brain, that can adapt to it and serve the same kind of functions. Yeah, it certainly can sometimes. However, the majority of the time, if your frontal lobe is entirely, or for the most part, destroyed, you're gonna have issues with inhibition for the rest of your life. whether that's sexual inhibition or if you want to behave in a particularly violent or goal-oriented way, you're going to have issues tempering that response because of this damage to the frontal lobe. You cannot wholesale just grow back or have another part of the brain that specializes in controlling inhibitions or temperament or what your responses to certain stimulus will be. So it's just cherry picking on the part of neuroplasticity. So there are 5 different areas where this has severe repercussions when you consider a complex theory of human nature, which involves a lot more of a bend on evolutionary psychology, behavioral genetics, and sociobiology, as well as a few other things that are usually demonized a hell of a lot in popular culture as right-wing disciplines. Not at all. The first of which is politics. So you've got a difference between tragic and utopian bends here. So the tragic bend would be the biological determinism, everything is determined by your father, your mother, your race, etc. And the utopian version would be, right, we're completely socially malleable, therefore politically we can change and socially engineer or politically engineer circumstances in which we will have a complete utopia. In circumstances where the utopian vision, the blank slate theory of human nature, has prevailed, it's typically mass murder. Typically mass murder, or at the very least, some very suppressing doctrines going on in education or at some level in that society. And that's what a fair amount of people don't realise when they advocate a blank slate theory of human nature. So the best phrase that this kind of new left that's coming along by this, I believe, is a philosopher called Peter Singer. He's a really interesting guy. The best quote that he said would motivate this new left that moves away from the blank slate theory of human nature is: it's time for the left to take seriously that we're evolved mammals and that we show this evidence not in our DNA and anatomy, but more so than that in our behaviour as well. So once we understand that, we can understand so much more if you're just not ideologically bent on that men are aggressive because it's socially learned or that it's influenced from a young age, for example. I know violence is the one I keep coming back to, but it's the one that's quite or most often used when you're talking about a blank slate theory of human nature or socialization or social constructionism, especially because it's ubiquitous everywhere that males are more violent than women. The idea that you can still obviously be left-wing, but once you advocate a complex theory of human nature involving things like evolutionary psychology, behavioral genetics, and sociobiology, you can come to understand a lot more, come up with solutions a lot easier that are more intuitive to than just teaching people not to be violent, or politically, crucially, you can talk about how there's no need for such talk as new society building, or even the opposite of that, which is that we should just be left to ourselves to fend in a very libertarian way. So once we have a complex theory of human nature, we're moving away from both of these extremes. So another one of these implications is for violence, and it's so common to say and quite trendy to say that violence, or that we know violence, is a socially learned phenomenon. Absolutely and entirely and patently false. The question should be not why do we aggress, it's why do we not aggress. We have throughout the entirety of our history been naturally selected as goal-oriented, a goal-oriented species. So for example, your ancestor, or you're here at some point because your ancestors were more violent than the others. If they needed more food, more space, access to females, access to status, whatever it may be, they got it because they were more violent and they killed off the opposition. And that doesn't mean that you're prone to be hella violent because they were, but it explains violence in how natural it comes to us, in our hormonal systems, in how much of a correlation it has to do with that. So not in a negative way, but societies impinge upon us in terms of how much they allow us to be violent. They tell us not to be violent. So if anything, our societies value far and away more peace and prospering than violence. And to say that especially Western society is prone to violence because it's a socially learned phenomenon is absolute bullshit. I mean, take for example something like a more feminist influenced United States as a country, although it's a complex country, far more influenced by feminism and by peaceful socialization, arguably. But places like Japan or Spain that have much more rigid gender roles in that circumstance are very, very peaceful, very, very peaceful. So those kinds of things don't really um, impact each other in the way that you might expect. It also explains crime in a number of ways, and obviously this is a complex theory of human nature, not just a genetic or evolutionary response to how to understand human nature or violence in this way. But at least for the most part, you can understand why, because of the roles that men have had in society from thousands of years ago, but even still to some extent, and obviously a large extent in a large portion of the world now, they are much more prone and easily gotten to levels of violence, but not just violence or aggression, but lethal violence comes very easily to men if left to their own devices, essentially. And almost every species, especially mammalian species, experience the exact same thing. But this is the thing about the ideology coming in here. It's just politically convenient or ideologically convenient to ignore this or to not explain it through these methods rather than to understand it as an evidence-based approach to human nature rather than an ideological one. So another one of the implications here is for children. So typically in using a lot of twin studies, there's a lot of evidence that we've got from this in terms of behavioural genetics and in just how through whether it's a shared environment or a non-shared environment in a fairly different culture or a different part of the country, that twins are remarkably similar when it comes to markers in personality or temperament, whether they're quiet or whether they're loud, whether they're brash, whether they're violent. So, I think the variance there was usually 0 to 10%, which shows just how much the environment plays and the level of genetics there. So that's genetically identical children in different environments entirely. You may have realised that the background has changed somewhat because my iPod ran out of memory and I needed to delete some space. But to continue on the exact same point that I was talking about, it's usually parenting style that actually adapts to children. So, for example, if you have not a very violent child, but let's say a child that uses aggression more than another, it's the parents that typically adapt to the child by using things like spanking as a means of getting to the child because aggression is the thing that they value and the thing that makes most sense to them. So it's often not the other way around, it's parents that adapt to the temperamental style of the child. The most important part of this that is related to socialisation is that peers are far and away more important for deciding the kind of child the kind of person that you're going to be than your parents do. So, for example, in a certain peer group, you may be a leader or a comic or one of the runts of the group, but that doesn't change whether you have a capacity to be angry or particularly emotional or very introvert. These are all traits that have remarkable predictive validity regardless of what situation you put, for example, identical twins in. The factor here is gender, and that's obviously a very contentious one to go along these lines, but I'll try and sort it out the best that I can. So one of the most important things to focus on here, just to focus on one, would be hormones. And what's remarkable is that some people pretend as though hormones play a very small role, if any role at all, in the kind of person that you're going to be, whilst at the same time acknowledging that people who are transitioning, if they have a change in hormone, they change their temperament a fair bit. So, for example, if someone is taking testosterone, if they're transitioning from becoming a woman to becoming a man, they have much higher rates of aggression, much higher rates of sexual promiscuity. Even their handshakes are harder, and they have a much higher need to dominate other people around them. So that's just to say something about the influence of testosterone and hormones in this kind of debate. So this is where two subsections of feminism typically come apart. So you have gender feminism and you have equity feminism. Gender feminism is typically the one that is postmodernist and social constructionist, things like violence, socially learned, and as we've seen so far, that's kind of a silly position to take, actually. Or you learn to become a man, and maybe you do, insofar as some components are concerned, but in terms of the things that set you apart, at least in hormones or aggression or violence, it's just not the case. So where equity feminism comes over is in saying that, look, there are real underlying realities to being women, and once we know and realise what those are, we can come up with the most intuitive ways to combat our own oppression in society. So equity feminism is actually the kind of feminism that most women agree with, and they disagree largely with gender feminism. Part of the reason behind this is because it seems very normal to accept physical differences between men and women. So it's things like upper body mass or strength in general, or one of the many varying different traits that men have that I suppose you could call superior to women, or height, for example, would be a good one, or just weight in general. But the moment that you say that those things might manifest in a mental faculty, or that mental faculties themselves are different from women's, that's where it's more of an issue with political correctness, or sticking with ideology purely for the sake of ideology, rather than where this kind of evidence seems to lead you, and the evidence seems to lead you in a direction towards equity feminism rather than anything to do with gender feminism. One of the kind of misleading parts about this debate as well, to do with gender, is that it's often pointed out that men are slightly more aggressive than women at the average point of the distribution. But as you go higher up the percentile, so for example, when you're in the 99th percentile of the most aggressive people in society, it's always the distribution is 99 or 100% of those are men. The same goes for the opposite. If you go to the most peaceable or um, you know, unconfrontational members of society, it's always women. And that kind of distribution corrects for almost every kind of statistic that you could correlate it with. So, for example, emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence at the range of the average range of distribution, men are slightly less intelligent emotionally, but when you get to the most emotionally intelligent people, 99% in the 99th, or let's say the 80th percentile, the correlation goes up. It's typically women who are in that situation. And the same is in fields for things like mathematics, where there are certain parts of the brain that are usually measured as bigger in men, to do with something like spatial reasoning, which is why the Einsteins or John Nashes are typically men. And it's why it can explain to some degree this kinds of differences in jobs that men go to, and that women go to, and women go into. And even though in places like Scandinavia, where you've had the real not harsh, but hard attempts at flattening the sociological landscape, those kinds of patterns actually get stronger. So it is more men that go into engineering and more women that go into nursing, because it's almost psychological law now that women are interested in people and men are interested in things. So some of the typical like pink and blue socialization theories are actually quite weak here, because you're saying something like giving children dolls or giving children trucks, or slight differences in social attitudes towards boys and girls, will actually manifest in these massive personality differences, and it's just incredibly difficult to extrapolate that and explain that at the kind of mass level that we have it. It's also worth pointing out that just because a discipline might be 50-50, for example, if there were 50-50% split between men and women in engineers, that wouldn't mean that the discipline was free of bias, no more than if there was a 70-30 split in favour of women who were nurses, that there was a bias towards men. So it's a myth that's often perpetuated by people in needing and wanting this kind of 50-50 split between men and women, or diversity splits, although is it's a good idea and it comes from a very good place, and that's something that in some places is quite necessary. For example, politics. Forcing these kinds of splits doesn't do anything conducive to human well-being. So the final factor that this influences is art. So typically, a blank slate theory of human nature has influenced postmodernist art in saying that there isn't really any kind of truth value in what we're trying to get across. And by art, I mean film, books, poems, song, anything like that. But part of the reason, like Stephen Pinker claims in the book, that why art connects us on such a human level is because it has emotional insight into our physical sufferings and shortcomings. So, for example, one of the reasons why Shakespeare's tragedies have lasted so long and are so influential is because they really connect at a sense of that there is a truth to the story that they're telling, which goes against any kind of blank slate theory or postmodernist idea of human nature. And even though it's quite a niche area in psychology, there are actually fields that would back this up. So there are studies into why certain kinds of prose in English are more resonate with us more, and we find more catchy. Certain areas of poetry we find more catchy. Even visually, there are studies that show that babies will stare at more beautiful faces for longer than unattractive faces, which lends some credence to the idea of a kind of almost objective reality of beauty, which is really interesting to think about. I mean, even something that would seem quite obvious is that everyone prefers, even if it's Skrillex for that matter, some kind of coherent musical structure. No one prefers strange, archaic sounds that don't seem to mean anything or fit into a kind of pattern. So, in total, it's typically bastardized versions of biological leanings on a theory of human nature that have led to this insistence upon never focusing or branding certain disciplines, especially in psychology, as this like right wing eugenics theory, evolutionary psychology, behavioral genetics, sociobiology, which doesn't really have much depth to it, and that strangely enough are dominated. Some of them are dominated by women, or even there's a fair amount of spread of minorities across these disciplines, which makes the idea that they're trying to manipulate women or minorities into certain positions in society is a bit ludicrous. Especially when you consider that, dependent on the topic that you want to talk about to a varying degree, things like evolutionary psychology account for, theoretically, a hell of a lot of the kinds of situations we're in now. If we go back to what Peter Singer said, it's remarkable how many people think that we're so separate from the kind of mammals that we've evolved from, just because we have a fair bit of intelligence and ability to talk and look at notes on a laptop and talk to an iPod, that these kinds of things don't seem to resonate with us as much, or are just right-wing theories of human nature. And we should really involve them in in a lot of different discussions that we have today. And I think it's a really good book, especially considering there are countless, I don't know how he's read all of them, it's mad, countless notes and references in the book. It's incredibly worth reading, and you'd have to be very scientifically literate to even disagree with some of the things that he's saying, especially considering that he's a hell of a smart guy. I think he works at Harvard, and yeah, that's all for this one. I think I'll be doing The Great Gatsby next, and thank you for listening. If you've got any comments on what I'm saying, if you want to even have a discussion about it, I wouldn't mind, especially if you know me. Yeah, thank you.